August 8th, 2026. The United States government steps to the podium and announces a sweeping 15% tariff on global polysilicon. The new trade policy is deliberately bundled with rigid artificial price floors. The stated objective from Washington is aggressive and absolutely clear. The administration intends to permanently break China's absolute, suffocating monopoly over the global solar supply chain. The mainstream headlines immediately frame this as a bold, necessary defense of American manufacturing. It is sold to the public as a critical strike against a foreign superpower that somehow stole the future of renewable energy out from under American workers. But there is a glaring, uncomfortable historical blind spot buried deep inside this narrative. China did not steal the polysilicon crown from the United States. The United States handed it over. To understand the profound, bitter irony of the 2026 tariff announcement, you have to look backward. You have to ignore the current political rhetoric and look at a specific patch of earth in Clarksville, Tennessee. Here, the ghosts of American industrial dominance are cast in thousands of tons of concrete and rusting steel.
In the early 2010s, this massive site was engineered to be the undisputed center of the global solar economy. It was a sprawling $1.2 billion mega project designed to churn out the ultra-pure silicon required to power the entire world. It was a true technological marvel. It was fully funded by private capital. It was physically built and ready to operate. And yet, it was completely abandoned before it ever produced a single ounce of commercial silicon. The United States did not lose its solar dominance to superior Chinese engineering, cheaper labor, or unbeatable foreign logistics. It lost its supreme dominance to a mathematical suicide. A single catastrophic policy decision in Washington triggered an unstoppable chain reaction that systematically dismantled America's most valuable energy asset. This is not a conventional story about a failed product or a bankrupt corporation. It is a documented investigation into the lethal, unforgiving mechanics of international trade. It is about how a government can accidentally bulldoze its own thriving empire while blindly trying to build a protective wall.
To truly comprehend the staggering scale of the failure in Tennessee, you first have to understand the specific material at the center of the conflict. Polysilicon is not just a generic commodity traded on an open exchange. It is the absolute foundational bedrock of the modern solar industry. It is a highly purified, crystalline form of silicon, refined through a volatile, toxic, and incredibly capital-intensive chemical process. You do not just decide to build a polysilicon plant in a few months. It requires massive, specialized physical infrastructure, deep technical expertise, and an absolute mastery of complex chemical engineering at extreme temperatures. In the late 2000s, the United States possessed exactly that rare mastery. The global solar supply chain was essentially divided into two distinct, interdependent halves. The United States and Europe controlled the high-value, high-tech production of the raw polysilicon material. China controlled the lower-margin, highly labor-intensive assembly of the final consumer solar panels. American chemical companies were the undisputed kings of the raw material. At the very center of this industrial empire was Hemlock Semiconductor. Based in Michigan, Hemlock was a quiet, formidable titan of industry. It was a highly successful joint venture, heavily backed by Dow Corning, and it held a massive, controlling share of the global polysilicon market. They were not struggling to compete on the global stage. They were the dominant entity that everyone else in the world was forced to buy from. By 2010, the global appetite for solar energy was exploding beyond all previous projections. Governments around the world were heavily subsidizing the transition to green energy. Demand for physical solar panels skyrocketed. And because every single solar panel required high-purity polysilicon to function, Hemlock was perfectly positioned to print massive amounts of money. The international trade dynamics were highly lucrative for the United States economy. American factories produced the complex chemical precursor. They sold it at a significant premium to Chinese manufacturers.
The Chinese manufacturers assembled the physical panels and sold them back to the global consumer market.
It was an incredibly profitable, seamlessly functioning ecosystem for American chemical companies. The United States maintained a massive, multi-billion-dollar trade surplus in this specific material. We were exporting billions of dollars of critical technology, leveraging our deep historical expertise in advanced manufacturing. The domestic polysilicon industry was not just surviving, it was expanding at a breakneck, almost unprecedented pace. Hemlock's existing Michigan facilities were operating at absolute maximum capacity. They needed to scale up their production, and they needed to do it immediately to capture the accelerating demand. The internal corporate math was incredibly simple. The entire world was transitioning to solar power. The sun was going to power the next century of human development, and American chemical plants were going to own the foundational technology of the sun. There was no visible, credible threat to this absolute dominance. The financial barrier to entry in polysilicon manufacturing was simply too high for new players.
Chinese competitors severely lacked the necessary capital, the proprietary reactor designs, and the decades of operational safety experience required to produce high-purity polysilicon at a massive scale. The American monopoly seemed totally secure, insulated by science and capital. The only operational challenge was building new facilities fast enough to meet the relentless, compounding global demand. This was an era of supreme, unquestioned industrial confidence, a moment when American executives looked at the global economic map and saw only guaranteed exponential growth. The strategic imperative handed down from the boardrooms was pure, unadulterated expansion. And that level of expansion required a new fortress of production, a facility so massive and technologically advanced that it would cement American dominance for the next 50 years.
The desperate search for the perfect expansion site ultimately ended in Clarksville, Tennessee. Hemlock Semiconductor did not make small, incremental bets. The Clarksville project was boldly envisioned as a $1.2 billion titan of heavy industry. It was a staggering, historic commitment of private capital. The specific location was carefully chosen for its immediate access to highly reliable, exceptionally cheap electricity provided by the Tennessee Valley Authority. This was a critical, non-negotiable requirement for the massive, energy-devouring process of refining raw silicon. Local and state governments aggressively courted the megaproject, offering millions of dollars in infrastructure upgrades, road construction, and long-term tax incentives. They fundamentally understood the economic stakes. This was not just another generic warehouse or assembly line. It was a foundational piece of critical manufacturing infrastructure for the 21st century. Construction began with supreme, undeniable optimism. Millions of cubic yards of earth were moved. Massive, reinforced concrete foundations were poured deep into the Tennessee soil. Intricate, sprawling networks of specialized piping and custom-built chemical reactors were shipped in and carefully assembled by thousands of skilled tradesmen. The Clarksville plant was designed from the ground up to be a true marvel of modern chemical engineering. It would take raw, unrefined metallurgical silicon and transform it through a highly volatile, dangerous process involving hydrogen chloride gas at extreme temperatures, eventually depositing ultra-pure polysilicon onto heated rods. The executives at Hemlock were operating on a clear, documented, and entirely rational set of financial incentives. The global solar market was screaming for their product. They had already secured massive, legally binding advance contracts. International buyers were essentially lining up to purchase the plant's future output years before the first chemical reactor was even turned on. The strategic corporate vision was flawless on paper. Hemlock would immediately double its global production capacity. It would lock in highly lucrative long-term supply agreements with the biggest Chinese panel manufacturers.
The incoming revenue would fund even further research and development, ensuring that American polysilicon technology remained an insurmountable generation ahead of any potential foreign rival. The psychology of the moment was pure industrial manifest destiny. The executives were not gambling blindly. They were executing a mathematical certainty based on established global supply and demand. But while Hemlock was pouring millions of dollars of concrete in Tennessee, a very different, highly dangerous kind of math was being calculated in the political corridors of Washington. The lower margin, commoditized side of the domestic solar industry was in severe distress. A small, vocal number of American companies that focused exclusively on assembling the final solar panels were struggling to compete with the absolute flood of cheap imports arriving from China. These domestic panel makers were losing market share rapidly and bleeding cash. They lacked the sheer manufacturing scale and the massive government subsidies that Chinese assemblers enjoyed. Facing bankruptcy, they began to aggressively lobby the United States government for immediate protection.
They framed their localized struggle not as a failure of their own outdated business models, but as a compelling victimhood narrative of illegal foreign dumping. They demanded sweeping tariffs. They wanted Washington to build a protective legislative wall to make Chinese solar panels artificially expensive in the American consumer market. The political incentives in Washington began to rapidly shift. The narrative of saving visible American manufacturing jobs is a highly potent, irresistible political weapon. Lawmakers focused intently on the highly publicized closure of a few small panel assembly plants. In doing so, they completely ignored the massive, quiet, multi-billion-dollar profitability of the American polysilicon export engine. The conflict was entirely internal. It was a fatal tension between the highly profitable, complex raw material producers and the struggling, commoditized panel assemblers. Hemlock's entire $1.2 billion bet relied absolutely on open, frictionless global trade. The domestic panel makers required closed, heavily taxed borders to survive. Only one faction could win this shadow war.
In 2012, the political dam finally breaks. The United States Commerce Department makes a decisive, ultimately fatal calculation. Washington formally announces heavy anti-dumping tariffs on imported Chinese solar panels. The punitive duties imposed range from 31% to over 250%. The explicit, stated intention is to protect the small, struggling domestic panel assemblers who are rapidly losing domestic market share. The political victory laps in Washington are immediate and loud. Press releases from lawmakers celebrate the robust, muscular defense of American manufacturing jobs. But international trade is not a simple one-way mechanism where a government can act without consequence. It is a highly sensitive system of brutal, reciprocal physics. You apply localized pressure, and the broader system strikes back with devastating precision. The Chinese Ministry of Commerce does not just absorb the financial blow or issue a polite, meaningless diplomatic protest. They ruthlessly analyze the entirety of the American solar supply chain, identify its most valuable and highly concentrated asset, and they execute a surgical, catastrophic retaliation. China officially announces devastating reciprocal anti-dumping duties on solar-grade polysilicon imported from the United States. The retaliatory duties are absolutely crushing, effectively placing a 57% import tax on material produced by American chemical titans like Hemlock. Overnight, the fundamental economic gravity of the entire global solar industry is completely inverted. The catastrophic math takes hold immediately. Hemlock Semiconductor's entire business model for the massive new Clarksville plant was predicated on exporting high-purity silicon to the massive, insatiable manufacturing hubs located in China. Suddenly, that primary, critical market is legally walled off. A Chinese panel maker simply cannot afford to buy American polysilicon with a massive 57% premium attached to it when European or South Korean alternatives remain entirely untaxed. The Chinese buyers immediately invoke force majeure clauses. They cancel massive, long-term supply contracts overnight. They scramble for alternative sources of raw material. The global supply chain violently realigns itself in real time, entirely bypassing the United States. Back in Tennessee, the Clarksville plant is nearly complete. The $1.2 billion has already been fully deployed. The complex chemical reactors are fully installed. The specialized high-pressure piping is tested and pressurized. The facility is physically ready to begin full-scale operations. but the economic reality surrounding it is a total, inescapable void. You cannot initiate the volatile, continuous chemical reaction of a billion-dollar polysilicon plant if your only viable global customers are legally prohibited from buying your product at a competitive price. Hemlock is caught in a paralyzing, inescapable trap. The executives stare at the rapidly deteriorating balance sheets, running every possible operational scenario. There is absolutely no domestic American market large enough to absorb the massive planned output of the Clarksville facility.
The European market is already heavily saturated and cannot possibly make up the multi-billion-dollar difference. The plant is economically dead before the main power switches are ever thrown. For 2 agonizing, surreal years, the sprawling facility sits in a state of suspended animation. It becomes a massive ghost ship of pristine steel and concrete, maintained by a skeleton crew, waiting desperately for a diplomatic miracle between Washington and Beijing that never arrives. The tension between the initial industrial idealism of the project and the harsh, unforgiving reality of the trade war is absolute. The barrier breaks permanently in December of 2014. Hemlock Semiconductor issues a cold, brief corporate statement and makes the agonizing decision to officially abandon the Clarksville megaproject entirely. They announce that the plant will never open. Not a single ounce of commercial polysilicon will ever be produced on the site. The highly specialized equipment is slated to be slowly dismantled. Millions of dollars of precision engineering are eventually sold for pennies on the dollar as scrap metal.
Hundreds of projected high-paying engineering, chemical, and manufacturing jobs vanish instantly into the Tennessee air. The $1.2 billion capital investment is effectively vaporized, written off as a total, staggering loss. The domino effect spreads rapidly across the broader American industry, crushing other domestic producers. American polysilicon dominance is permanently broken. But the tragedy of the Clarksville plant is only the first half of the systemic catastrophe. By aggressively locking American polysilicon out of the Chinese market, Washington did not just destroy its own highly profitable export engine, it provided the ultimate, unavoidable incentive for China to aggressively build its own independent supply. Faced with a sudden lack of reliable American raw materials, the Chinese government poured massive state subsidies into domestic polysilicon production. They aggressively acquired the necessary technology. They built their own massive chemical refining plants in Xinjiang and Inner Mongolia. They scaled up production capacity with terrifying speed and absolute ruthlessness. The 2012 American tariffs did not save the domestic solar industry. They actively forced China to become entirely self-sufficient across the entire vertical supply chain. The United States sacrificed a highly profitable, high-tech global monopoly to temporarily protect a low-margin, commoditized assembly business that ultimately failed anyway. It was a strategic failure of spectacular, historic proportions. The mechanism of protectionism functioned exactly as the political class designed it to, and in doing so, it annihilated the very industrial supremacy it was supposed to defend. The invisible, rusting ruins of Clarksville offer a profound, lasting lesson in the architecture of unintended consequences. We arrive back at August 8, 2026. The United States government is once again deploying the heavy weapon of tariffs, a new sweeping 15% duty on global polysilicon, deliberately paired with aggressive artificial price floors designed to manipulate the market. The political rhetoric echoing through the halls of Washington is virtually identical to the speeches given in 2012. We must break foreign dominance. We must secure the critical energy supply chain. We must aggressively protect American innovation from unfair foreign competition. But the underlying industrial reality has fundamentally and permanently changed over the last 14 years. Washington is no longer defending an existing, thriving American empire. It is desperately trying to resurrect a complex, deeply technical industry that it systematically destroyed with its own policies. The 2026 tariffs are a reactive, desperate policy designed entirely to fix a severe national vulnerability created by the 2012 tariffs. The cycle of protectionism operates like a closed, inescapable loop of industrial destruction. The United States once held the absolute keys to the solar future. It possessed the deep capital, the advanced intellectual property, and the massive physical infrastructure required to dominate the most critical, high-margin component of the global renewable energy transition. And it traded that absolute leverage away in a localized, short-sighted political panic over low-margin assembly jobs. The empty fields where the Clarksville plant once stood remain a quiet, devastating monument to that specific historical failure. It is a billion-dollar tombstone for an industry that was never defeated by a superior foreign competitor, but was instead suffocated by its own government's miscalculated spreadsheet. The modern global economy does not forgive strategic errors of this immense magnitude. When a deeply integrated, highly technical supply chain shifts across the ocean, it rarely shifts back.
The investment capital moves permanently. The complex engineering expertise relocates and embeds itself in new foreign ecosystems. The institutional memory of how to safely and profitably operate these massive chemical facilities slowly fades away. America is now spending billions of taxpayer dollars through new subsidies and massive legislative acts, trying to desperately incentivize private companies to rebuild the exact same manufacturing capacity that it effectively forced Hemlock Semiconductor to scrap a decade ago. We are paying a massive, historic premium to recreate a fortress we already built and voluntarily abandoned. The entire ordeal exposes the hidden, catastrophic risk of using blunt trade instruments to solve complex supply chain realities. Intention is entirely divorced from outcome. The mechanism of the tariff inherently assumes that the global market is static, that a country can simply block an import without suffering a reciprocal, targeted strike against its own vital exports. Clarksville proves definitively that this assumption is a fatal illusion.
The haunting question lingering over the new 2026 tariff policy is not whether it will successfully hurt foreign competitors in the short term. The real question is whether a nation can ever truly buy back an industrial future that it willingly threw away.